Okay, hello everybody. Here we are on a very cold end of November night. We're getting ready for good old final exam time for FA255. And so let's just get into the program and find out what you have to know about it, know about what's been going on in order to pass the exam. Before I do that, however, let me just give you a little plug. I will be speaking on the 18th, 19th, and the afternoon of December 20th at the Holt Center, the Soaring Theater, and I will be talking about how the media gave us most of what we think of as tradition at Christmas time. That accompanies the Radio Redux production of Miracle on 34th Street. So I'm just giving you that plug. I'll be there if you want to find out something about the history of how media gave us a historical view of Christmas. And at the same time, you can enjoy living history because the Radio Redux folks do a fantastic job of presenting what it was like during the golden age of radio. So there's my plug. So anyway, I'll be there, and Merry Christmas and all that sort of thing. So now let's move on to the final exam review and take a look and find out what you need to know. All right. First of all, the exam will be pretty similar to what happened last time. It's going to be 1 week only. The exam begins this Thursday, December 3rd, and it will run through the 10th, 1 week only again. It'll be given at the same location, the Center Building, 311. That's the Instructional Testing Center. So, you know, the whole works, everything is going to be exactly like it was during the midterm. The exam does close early on Thursday. So it's really important that you get in there because they do have, at the end of the term like this, you know, everybody gets busy, and they do close out early on Thursday. I think they close by 5 o'clock, but don't quote me on that. So don't wait for the last minute, and because there'll be no makeup exams. So don't tell me that your grandmother died again and you can't make the exam. Just get it done with during that week. Check for their Saturday hours. Do all the same kind of things that you did for the midterm. And again, it's going to be just exactly like it was. It's an objective exam, 50 questions, no writing, nothing like that. It's going to be identical to the midterm. So if you put those two together, if you splice the midterm with the final, you'd have a 100-page test. And study guides are now available on Moodle. And I think you will like this study guide very much. This study guide is, shall we say, specific, and I think it will help you get through the exam. And so, Merry Christmas. All right. And just to remind you one more time, just like before, it's at the Instructional Testing Services. It's their center. And it's in the Center Building, 311, and just like before, you know, you got to do all that ID stuff. And you also can take with you one 3x5 note card. And always, as I just emphasize this part, be sure and check and verify the hours of the testing lab. Make sure that you're there so you have enough time to take the exam, because when they close, and if you're not done with the exam, tough. Okay. A little word about extra credit. Your extra credit is due a week from tomorrow. That's December 8th by 10:30. So the deadline is December 8th at 10:30 in the morning. And I prefer the email submissions. That works wonderfully. But if you are old-fashioned about it and type up an old paper, you have to get it to me postmarked no later than December 4th so I can get all of these papers read and get the grades in on time. But I haven't had hard copy like that in years. So sending it along the email works perfectly. And if you do have some hard copy or whatever and you're not mailing it, you can bring it to my office, because I'll be in my office at that time. That's the usual time for my office hours, and I'll take it then. All right, so what are we looking at? Well, we're going to start with, at least for the final exam, we're starting with the combat film, and we're ending with the edge of, or going through the edge of Hollywood and ending with film in the television age. So it's the last half of the course, actually. So let's take a look at the combat film. So what did they talk about in the video section, video presentations, and what did they talk about in the book with regard to the combat or war film? Well, the things that you need to know about it are the features of the genre. And the first thing is that laws and morality get suspended in the war film. It's almost like every man for himself. It's one of those cases of forget the law, we got to survive. An important part is number 2 there. It's a switch from the individual to the group, to troops, to fellowship. Often in the war film, what we do is we set up a group, and we have all kinds of personalities that fit that group. It is the story of that group, and the movie is usually, a combat film is broken down so that we look at the various kinds of people who are there in that group. But the essential heroic side of the war film is the group itself. And often that is where you find a major figure, a leader in that group, who sacrifices himself. He dies in combat, but he dies so that others may live. This is an interesting thing because this works against the Western. We've already talked about the Western. We've already had an exam over the Western, and we know that one of the primary forces in a Western that pushes along the narrative is the individual. This is just the opposite. It is the group. But in many respects, that group acts like an individual. Okay, and point number 3 for the combat film is women as emotional element that brings out male vulnerability. Often what we have in the combat film is all of these men together, the camaraderie that they have, and it's very macho, it's very masculine. And then in the middle of this comes a woman, and the woman becomes very much the catalyst, the figure, the thing that brings out the male vulnerability. This is demonstrated perfectly. It's a perfect example of that can be found in a film made in 1949 called The Sands of Iwo Jima with John Wayne. A perfect example of that. It's almost as if it's prima facie case here for that point number 3. So if you ever get the chance, on Netflix or whatever, to take a look at The Sands of Iwo Jima, you'll see that in action. Also, the series told us about films and the anti-war sentiments in post-war films. We still have anti-war sentiments that are made during World War II and the Korean War, these films, but they're not the same kind of anti-war sentiments that you find later on. What you find in these is the sense that nobody wants to go to war. But sometimes you have to. Sometimes you're backed into a corner and you have no alternative. And part of that was what they call the Sergeant York theme, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And the other thing is, number 2 there, war films and portrayal of racial integration of the armed forces, in which they were not integrated. They were segregated throughout World War II. It was not until Truman integrated the armed forces in 1948 that you had that. And how did the films portray this sort of thing? Okay. The fundamental ideology that you find here, the fundamental philosophy in the war film, combat film, is this: we may not always win physically, but we are always right ideologically. Okay, it is the idea, it is our sense of Americanism, our sense of fair play, our sense of all of these kinds of things that defined Americanism at the time. These things will triumph even though, you know, we may have lost the battle. And in some films, they actually do lose out. In some films, we lose. But we know by the end of the film, what matters is that our values will survive and will become victorious. Also, the Office of War Information, the significance of that. The role of the U.S. government in Hollywood film production at this time was primarily, number one, for propaganda, obviously, and shaping public opinion. What you have at this time is actually Hollywood working with the government to produce films to aid in shaping public opinion. In other words, to create and inspire hope in all of those who stayed home. You know, this is an overseas war. We don't have any combat going on inside our country. And so what you have is a lot of people who are staying home and wondering, you know, what's going on overseas. And the government works at this with Hollywood, and they produce some fantastic films to bolster morale on the home front. And then the second thing that we mentioned earlier is the Sergeant York formula is depicted in a lot of these films that are sponsored by the Office of War Information. And we have to say there's two things here. One is that there were actual films that were made by the Office of War Information, like documentary films, but also the dramatic films that were produced by the Hollywood studios worked in conjunction with the OWI to make sure that there was a positive, underlying positive philosophy in all of those films to help with that public opinion. And in those films is when they used the Sergeant York formula, which is this. It depicts the conversion of an objector to a supporter. That is, the Sergeant York was a famous hero of World War I who was a pacifist who got into the war and became a hero. So for World War II, they actually made a movie about Sergeant York, a very famous movie with Gary Cooper. And it depicts this guy that says, I want nothing to do with war. War is terrible. War is hell. Blah, blah, all of those things that go with all the objections to war. But then once you get in the middle of all of this, and once you see that your own way of life is at risk and that you would not be able to even say, I object to war and all of that, you suddenly become a supporter of it and you get involved in it. That theme was used as the heroic conversion in a lot of these films that were made during the war. And the interesting thing is that John Wayne, in probably the worst war of all for America, the war in Vietnam, when he made a pro-Vietnam War, that is pro only in the sense of supporting troops, supporting our ideology and that kind of a thing, what did he use in that film as his theme and as his plot device, to drive the film along, was the Sergeant York formula. So even in 1968, to make a kind of pro-film, as it were, about Vietnam, we go back to the Sergeant York formula. Okay, we also, during this time, we enjoyed film noir. As I always say, it's just about everybody's favorite genre, but the question is it a true genre? We do know that it's a French word meaning black film. They were and are adaptations of American pulp fiction and hard-boiled novels. Now, film noir just simply was a bunch of movies that Americans didn't even know they were making or watching until they were discovered in France. In post-war France, and which we'll talk about later when we went through all of the French journals, the serious look at films like the Cahiers du Cinéma, and these critics, like Truffaut and so forth, they found these films. And what they liked so much about these films was essentially their look. And what they had here, they began to describe these films, and they described them according to the way they looked, and which was very dark and became black film. So we look at that, and we also look at these things. These are the things that set these films apart. The first one, and a very obvious one, is the setting. They are always urban. It's always in the middle of town. It's right down in the smack dab in the center of town, and you might say in the sleazy side of the city. And it seems as though there's always rain-slicked streets. In other words, and one thing that's obvious is that it's not mentioned there, but it's obvious also, is that it's always at night. It's always dark. So it's done at night. There's rain-slicked streets, and it's the sleazy side of city life. This is the kind of film that gives us the whole notion that you shouldn't go out at night in these areas of town. The themes: alienation and existentialism. The characters are all, or seem to be, loners. They cannot relate to other people well, and they always seem to be trying to manipulate other figures, other people. Often the hero of this type of film is the guy that we like most because he's the least like the rest of them. It's not that he is above what they are. He's exactly like the rest of them, but he has some scruples. He has something about him, that some character part of him that keeps him separated from the others who are outright scoundrels. There is also the sense, a theme here, of existentialism, the sense that you cannot escape. You cannot get out of this life. That this sleazy side of life is going to eat you up and spit you out. The character types, the primary one is the private detective, as you see there. This is all about, this of course comes from those hard-boiled novels that we mentioned earlier, but the private detective, this is a guy that is not bound by laws. This is a private citizen, and he functions like a police force. He investigates crime. In many cases, what he'll do is he's investigating a crime out of a concern for revenge. Somebody he knows has been murdered. Someone that is close to him has been murdered, so he's going to find the culprit out of revenge. But because he is a private detective, he is not bound by laws. The other thing about the character types, the other two things are, we find in there the antisocial loners again. We mentioned that earlier, that all of these people just seem to be lost in their own little world. They can't relate to other people. And when they do relate to other people, again, as I said before, it's manipulation. And frequently, one of the driving forces of the narrative is amnesia. That somewhere in there, someone has a past, and they cannot remember the past. And it's a bad past. It is something that the reason they can't remember it is because it's so horrendous, they don't want anything to do with it. But also, there are literal amnesiacs. Literally, in many of the films, they cannot remember who they are, what's happened, or anything. My favorite all-time, best, that I love of film noir, Black Angel, is that very subject. He can't remember a thing. And he can't remember it because, well, I don't want to spoil it. Spoiler alert, so if you're ever going to watch the movie, close your ears here, but it's because he turns out to be the killer. Okay, moving on. The film style. Now, this is the thing that people talk about. This is the thing they like about film noir. This is what the French discovered, too. When they first saw these kinds of films, there's very much a style involved here, and it involves these very subjects here, these very things. Low-key lighting. It's very dark. There are shadowy elements. That's one of the things that sort of defines film noir for us, is light and shadow, lots of chiaroscuro lighting effects. People are in shadow and light. It's often you have just a, in many of these, you might be talking to somebody and you just see their lips. The rest of the face is in a shadow. There are strange highlights, like I just mentioned there. There's these highlights where only partially, an eye. The guy has two eyes, but you only see one eye because he's in shadow. People walk in and out of shadows. And, of course, the extreme camera angles, high and low angles, with distortion, what they call Dutch angles, which is off-kilter. The camera looks this way. And it's the film I mentioned earlier, my favorite one, Black Angel. It starts with a very obscure type of low angle. The main character walks up to a signpost, leans against the signpost, looks up to the tall skyscraper, and the camera cuts to that low angle, and then in a very weird way, the camera just goes all the way up the side of the building and into the top floor. A very striking image. The production code and film noir. Film noir often alluded to prohibited subjects without directly violating the code. They got away with a lot of stuff. And the gender issues in film noir, the bottom line is that women served as femme fatales. The feminist film critics really picked up on film noir because this is the first series of films in which women are really, really strong. This is the first kinds of films that we see in which women dominate, and they are strong, very strong individuals who control their lives. They're not at the mercy of anybody, and often in these films, they are actually really controlling men. You see that in one of the classic of all film noir films called Double Indemnity, with Barbara Stanwyck, that controls every move that Fred McMurray makes. Okay, in summary then, excuse me a minute while I take a drink. Film noir is a social commentary on post-war reality. The war's over, and what kind of a culture do we have? We have a modern mass American culture, mass media. We are connected by radio, by telephone, and soon by television. There is consumerism. We are now have a new prosperity, and what we have is lots of things to buy. And television will begin to push this. And we have a disillusionment with Paradise Lost. In the middle of all of that, what we have is a culture that also is very uneasy with itself, because this is mid-century, and before this victory over Nazism and the victory over the Japanese imperialism and that sort of thing, but we've gone through nothing but heartache. We've gone through World War I, that little prosperity between World War I and the Depression is very minor, and then we have this long depression. Then we go into even a bigger war. So this, after 5 decades of living this very depressed culture, we're not so sure if we're ever going to get out of it. Okay, film in the television age, post-war decline in attendance. I mentioned that way back when, at the very beginning, during our orientation session, that what we have is a very unique thing. In 1946, that is the year in which there were more people attending theaters than ever before. It far surpassed what had ever happened in theater attendance, and yet the following year it dropped off to the worst. The threat of television was there, but TV was not the only culprit. There was more leisure time, there was more money, and there were interest in other activities, and there was a sudden migration to the suburbs, away from the downtown theaters. And drive-ins start to take over. Agreements between motion picture industry and the TV, well, essentially at the beginning of it, movies would have nothing to do with TV, and then they realized that what TV does best is sell stuff. And so TV becomes a subsidiary market for motion pictures. The movie industry's response to competition from television and decline in attendance, simply technical innovation. give the people something in theaters, in movies, that they otherwise can't see at home on their small TV screens. So what we have here is flat to wide. In other words, we have these widescreen systems, such as Cinerama, which was the curved screen, giant curved screen, 3D, objects coming at you. And then they settled down with CinemaScope, which was just simply the wide screen, very wide screen. And that was supplanted by Panavision, and the only reason is that Panavision was essentially the same as CinemaScope, except it had finer lenses and gave you a clearer picture and a faster lens. And so Panavision replaced CinemaScope. Also, you should have a good idea, according to our movie series, about the aspect ratio, width to height of the projected image. That's when we talk about, you know, the 16:9 and all of that sort of thing. And understand the technical modifications for widescreen to TV. The idea that many of these classic films originally had to be panned and scanned in order to see it on TV, which destroyed the composition of the frame. Then they went to letterboxing, understand what is meant by the safe action area, and all you filmmakers are already familiar with that. The creative innovations by independent producers in the 1950s, and that was primarily a company that began just as other companies were failing, called American International Pictures, and they discovered the teen market. And they also discovered monsters. Monsters were everywhere in the 1950s, and they were low-budget exploitation films to go with that subject. They were all mostly made by independent producers. They were making tons of money, and it was American International that combined the two. You had the teen market, and you combined it with monsters, and you ended up with a movie like I Was a Teenage Werewolf, and made bazillions of dollars and started a whole new trend. Okay, in the 1960s, there is a transition in Hollywood. You have the older generation with regard to sexuality as presented in a film with Rock Hudson and Doris Day called Lover Come Back. At the end of that decade, you have the younger generation dealing with sexual matters in a film called The Graduate. Also at this time, the older generation goes to movies. The younger generation goes to see films. So in the film, I'm not going to list all of those things because you'll find them on the study guide. But we have a cultural change going on in the 1960s. It's what we call the counterculture movement. It's the ideological war, Vietnam, and the generational war, and what it essentially means is baby boomers versus their conservative elders. We have a socio-political climate of the United States, first by Camelot, JFK, then the Great Society with LBJ, civil rights under Martin Luther King, and then we have Nixon and, you know, dirty politics and all of that sort of thing. We have university protests against everything. We have nonviolent activism versus violent eruptions. And then we have a craziness that goes on with assassinations and riots. They're tearing down cities, and we're assassinating people that we look up to. JFK is assassinated, Martin Luther King gets assassinated, and Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated. We also have now, and we have the women's lib, the idea of sexual revolution. And the workforce changes. Women are in jobs. We have new things like the pill, and we also have, you know, abortion becomes legal. The sexual revolution is essentially a commercial revolution. It is to make money off of sexuality. So, you know, pornography takes over. The images of women change. They're gone now or we see them in both in pejorative senses there as either virgins or whores. You see the image of youth, the college kids with their half-baked ideas. Images of race that's dealt with more directly than with images of women and youth issues. But the roots of racism never get addressed. We have all of these exploitation films, but it's still there. There is still a censorship in the movies because by getting it rated, some theater circuits, you know, would not show X-rated films. Like you couldn't like take, I don't know, what's the, I can't think of any right now because they've all kind of disappeared. But at the time, there were many theater circuits, and they would say, we don't show X-rated films. So if you did something that would get you an X-rated film, that film wasn't going to be shown in those theaters. So you either had to cut that out or just say, well, I'll try to make my money somewhere else. And so that stuff is still going on. The rating system, all it did was legitimize a lot of that stuff. And it was, and you know, it's all commercial. It's all based on money. Because it was, in the beginning, there was only PG. There was no PG-13. The PG-13 rating was the result of Steven Spielberg's influence in the industry, because he wanted to show a little more and have a little more discussion about things, but he didn't want an R rating because his market was mostly getting kids in the family into like E.T. and those kinds of things. So they gave in and said, well, okay, we agree. We'll make this halfway between thing called PG-13. And it was a marketing tool. In many respects, it was a marketing tool. You can, Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie in 1977, the first one was rated R. Or no, I'm sorry, it was rated G. It's the other way. It went the other way. It was rated G, but at that time, that was the kiss of death. That meant a little dinky cartoon film. So Lucas went back and he inserted the shot of that alien's arm that had been cut off. There was a scene where the bad guy alien, I think it was inside that bar scene, and they took the lightsaber and they hit him, you know, and then they showed a shot of this arm, this decapitated, or not decapitated, but cut off arm, bloody stump and everything. And they inserted that and put it back to the rating administration, and they said, oh, that's blood and guts, you get a PG. Because that meant more, I would not have the kiss of death of a G rating. And at this time, younger and more affluent people were going to the movies. Eggheads. And as we move along, there's all that new wave stuff. I don't think you have to worry too much about that stuff. Just be familiar with modern filmmakers and examples of their works. And the modern ones for us at this time, with this film series, is Lucas, Spielberg, Scorsese. And the ones on the fringe, such as Julie Dash, a feminist filmmaker. And also with the idea that a movie just ain't a movie anymore. No, I'm not going through all of that. You don't have to worry about that. The new media, it's now horizontal control rather than vertical control, because the movie industry, in order to get your money back, you just don't make a movie anymore. You make a movie that also has all this stuff that's guaranteed, the stuff on the side, a soundtrack album, toys, a novelization of it, video game of it. All of these things have to be part of that movie so that you can make all your money back. And what's going to happen is anyone's guess, because when you stop and think about TV is dying. We have fewer and fewer people watching television. Everybody's watching stuff on the internet. The movies, they are in bad shape. Very few people go to the movies. It's not like it used to be. They keep losing, and they only go. It's as one person said, this is very similar to the Roman games, the circuses. It's a big deal that you go to. Like, what is everybody waiting to see right now? Yes, exactly. It's an event. It's not a movie. It's an event. And you don't have all of these other little fillers because just people aren't going to the show anymore. You know, you might have a big event. You could say an event like Gone with the Wind in 1939, but at the same time, you had all these other movies that you could go to. And then you go to Gone with the Wind and pay your $5, which was quite a bit of money in those days. to see Gone with the Wind, which was the major event, but you could still go every night and see something different. We don't have that. We don't have that today. We make very few films, and everyone tries to make an event, to make bazillions. You just can't make money to offset what you spent on this movie and make a few extra bucks. No, it's got to be huge. And look how much we spend all that time tracking box office amounts of money. I mean, every week, you know, even on the normal news cycle, every week they talk about, well, this movie made this amount of money. Well, who cares? Except the studio, but it's an event, you see. It is something that's... And the TV stations are owned or are part of the entertainment industry, so they, in the news cycle, just they play against, you know, they promote their own stuff. Yeah, that's it. That's all you need to know. It's